enemy of your enemy is not your friend. I think if a lesson could be learned from what is going on in Afghanistan right now with the Taliban and how the Taliban have returned to power in Afghanistan, I think that could be a big part of it. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. That whole enemy of your enemy business has been used by many people, and many people have been hurt by it over and over again. By many people, a lot of those many people have been the US government, where they have gone in and attempted to do different things and build nations and try to get into the technical aspect of building a nation from the ground up. Really and truly, some of it was kind of social experiments where they would go in and they would attempt to use what they have learned in universities and what they have studied to attempt to artificially build nations. And I don't think any of them have ever worked and ever survived. I hope they would stop doing it because it's kind of creating more problems than it is solving. This problem started way back, and it seems like it's not going to be solved anytime soon. One of the difficult things with this is that on multiple sides of it, it seems to be the bad guys. The bad guys seem to be fighting the bad guys, and it's a struggle to determine whose side you want to win. Which side do you think you would support when both sides are bad guys? And then the results of what both sides, not only both sides, and that's the other thing in these kind of scenarios, sometimes it's not even both sides, as if it's as simple as just one side versus the other. There are multiple sides, and sometimes no side is correct, or all sides are some form of correct. The story of this, I'm going to go back over some brief history of the Taliban. I did some of it in the contemplation from yesterday. If you saw that, you'd have a general idea of it. But I don't mind going back over it. And I think watching the history of how the Taliban formed, of the creation of Afghanistan to some extent, the Afghanistan of the last 20 or 30 years, a lot of that has to do with why we are seeing what we are seeing now. If you want to understand why we are seeing people sitting at the side of planes trying to take off, I mean, that's ludicrous to think about. Why would you sit on the outside of a plane that is taking off? That idea wouldn't work. And it ended tragically for a lot of, well, for I believe it was 7 people lost their lives like that. At least I think that was what I saw in the news article, somewhere around that number. But if you'd like to know why that is, it starts way back. The history of it gives some understanding of it. Another question I've had is, and I've seen other people ask this, when you look at the crowds running, a lot of the crowd seem to be men within fighting age. And these men would rather flee the country than attempt to fight for this country. Why wouldn't they fight for this country that is theirs? Why wouldn't the army of the country that has been trained for all these years and have all this advanced equipment and weaponry, why wouldn't they fight for the country? Well, it's in the history. To start off again, around the same time I started off in the contemplation, around the Cold War. One of the difficult things about speaking about historical and real world events online is when you're describing it, you're not sure exactly how much to describe sometimes because you're speaking to a wide swath of people. People who may know nothing about it and people who may be experts. So I'm speaking about the Cold War and I brush over something or I say something in error and not to know there's a Cold War expert out there and they're listening this like, that's an error there. Harumph, I see. Or I just browse over something at a brief summary, and someone who has no idea what this Cold War business is completely lost. So the Cold War, as adverse, of course, to Hot War, was fought between, well, I don't know if to say fought, but you know what I mean, was done between the United States and the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic, I believe, something like that. The Soviets, the Russians, and the Americans, they fought a proxy war. So they had this principle called MAD. Yes, MAD. What's an abbreviation? It stood for Mutually Assured Destruction, meaning we both have nuclear warheads here if you start to fight me, I will blow you up, and if I blow you up, you will blow me up, and we'd both be destroyed. And what value would that be to any of us? So we have mutually assured destruction, so we can't actually fight each other. So you know what we will do? We'll pump money into nations all around the world and have these nations fight on behalf of us. That's some evil stuff, if you ask me. If you have your problem with each other, I say choose 50 of your best men and go slug it out somewhere, or change it into sports. Let sports be the world peace let sports be the solution to world peace. Go battle it out in sports or something. But to take other nations and battle it out among them, and that Cold War was the genesis of the terms First World, Second World, Third World. If you heard those terms, it was generated way back in the Cold War time. Now, during the Cold War time, the Soviets decided that they wanted Afghanistan. Afghanistan, geographically, is neighboring to the Soviet Union or Russia. Well, nearly everything in the Asian and European continent is kind of neighboring to Russia. It's massive. And they decided that they want Afghanistan. So they moved in to take Afghanistan. But there were some problems with Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a mountainous region. Nearly the entirety of Afghanistan is what may be considered by some uninhabitable mountainous regions. But it wasn't uninhabitable. It was inhabited by various tribes. And these tribes had loose relations with each other, but many of the tribes didn't even agree with each other. They didn't have a common, one singular ruling class between them. But when you're being attacked, generally you tend to come together a bit more. So upon this attack, they came together. Obviously, they didn't have to do it alone because the US was fighting the Soviet Union. So anyway, the Soviets were, the Americans were there in the background or the foreground, funding their opposition. In this case, they funded the rebels in Afghanistan. The rebels in Afghanistan became known as the Mujahideen, and these were the people who pushed back against the Soviets. Eventually, the Soviets gave up. The Soviets had some control over Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is a difficult thing to control. When I look at Afghanistan, Afghanistan looks like a recipe for disaster. If you want to have a disastrous run at things as a military general, go try Afghanistan, because it seems like it's difficult to hold because many of the attackers take the cities relatively easy, but it's nearly impossible to defend from the locals, because the locals who have the run of the mountains, unless we're going to carpet bomb the entirety of the mountains and turn it into the plains, you have no choice but to take this constant pestering that even the US did for the last 20 years. So the Mujahideen eventually beat back the Soviets and they won their independence from the Soviets. But that was short-lived as a positive thing, because now these former tribesmen were left with advanced weaponry that they would have gotten from the US. They were left with trauma because it was a war, and this war continued, I believe, for nearly a decade time. So these men would have been war-hardened, and a lot of the women and children left the region because while the war is going on, oh gosh, let's be real here. The women and children leave as refugees. Some of these children, the young males, end up in schools inside of Pakistan. And some of these schools teach an extremist style of religion. And these young males are the ones that are really important to the story eventually. Because the Mujahideen that were right now in Afghanistan, they were doing their own thing. They were running a thuggery mission over in Afghanistan there. With weapons and warring tribes, the laws were up for grabs, as it were. Who had power ruled. And that chaos left the perfect atmosphere for the students of these schools, the refugee children who left their homeland and would have been schooled through this childhood trauma and inculcated with an extreme style of religion. They came back in and they started sweeping through Afghanistan, taking over many of the checkpoints that the Mujahideen would have had, and they would have been celebrated as liberators by many people within Afghanistan, because for some of these people, living under the Mujahideen would have been torture. Now, granted, living under the Taliban wasn't exactly much better, but it was some better, and at least now there would have been some semblance of justice. Now, behind the scenes for all of this, while all of this is going on, the schools that would have had to have trained these Taliban soldiers, well, Taliban students, Taliban means students, those schools would have been funded by some people. And all along, while the Taliban are doing their thing, they would have been funded by some people. And now, this Taliban that would have been ruling in Afghanistan during the 90s, they would have been ruling, one, with an iron fist, and that may be something, an argument for how you may have to rule fictitious tribal lands. It may just be one of those things. That's just how it has to be done. That's an argument. But they were ruling with an iron fist, and also there was a natural, for lack of a better word, because violence is a natural form of how many nations are formed. And these young men, young at that time, these men would have been from the region, so they had at least some rightful claim to this. Now, with the US, when the US moved in, they moved in to take out Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda wasn't exactly the Taliban. Al-Qaeda was a specific extremist group that they say were being hidden by the Taliban. Al-Qaeda, I believe Al-Qaeda was a Mujahideen group that would have been trained directly by the US to fight the Soviets back in the 80s. Bin Laden himself was trained by the US. That's common news. And when they went in there, they accused the Taliban of hiding Al-Qaeda, and they went in to get it. They removed the Taliban. The Taliban, now, to be clear and upfront with it, the Taliban isn't a very nice governing body. If you're a woman, you do not want to be a civilian under the Taliban. They have some very extreme, stringent, and super conservative, if we'd call it that, views for how to run society. But the society was running in some way. Now, when the US came in and met that reality there, and they removed the Taliban, and they tried to put in a government that they think would have ruled and held the people together. Remember, these are varying tribes. From the very beginning, from the onset, this government would have been seen as not really a legitimate government from the people, from the Afghani people. This government was there only because of the power of the Americans. And it would seem, at least judging by how quickly the Taliban rolled back through, a lot of the people within the Afghani society weren't really interested in how the Americans were running the country either way. And they didn't have much interest in fighting for that. And another thing, when I spoke earlier about why many of the Afghani men left, if there's no one unitary Afghani identity, like in Trinidad, I am a Trinidadian. I have at least some amount of loyalty, some amount of patriotism held towards me as a Trinidadian, as a Trini, towards the red, white, and black flag. There's something that does to you. But if our country was set up in a different way, and my loyalty was set to where I am located, I'm from Central, so I was loyal to the tribe of the Shogunas people. And then somebody tries to come and place a government in to rule the entirety of Trinidad. And then they try to put me in the military to fight for the entirety of Trinidad. I don't agree with the entirety of Trinidad. I don't have that shared value for what the entirety of Trinidad represents to me. So to fight for that may be much more difficult. For me to be motivated to come out and lay down my life, because that's literally what you're going to have to do. I have to risk my life for this. Is this that I'm risking my life for something that I believe in? And I think that may have been the problem with Afghanistan in the first place. You're trying to get people to fight for something that you want them to believe in, but how do you actually get them to believe in it? And I think the Taliban had the right idea on how they get them to believe it. How did the Taliban form in the first place? What is the meaning of Taliban? Students. As with everything, to wheel this back into education, as with everything, I think the history, the facts of it, the real crux of the matter stands or starts in the education system, in the schooling of the younger generation. And if you don't school that younger generation, you could go in and spend the $2 trillion that the US did, trying to change the adults, trying to train them and change their hearts and buy them and get them to understand what you like them to believe. And it just wouldn't work. While another side would try a different technique and build schools for all the refugees and train the next generation. They already give up on the first generation, train the next generation for the next 20 years to do their bidding. And if you'd like to win in anything, if you have a view of success in society on a long-term scale for anything, that's the secret there. Educate the young, the students, the Taliban. I hope you were entertained, or you enjoyed, or you were informed by this. If you were, please do share the video, drop a comment, tell me what you think about it, click that like button. If you're not subscribed, please do subscribe, and I'll see you again tomorrow for the next video.
Feel the music, rising with the time.